Hello everyone. Just had to change one setting before we could get started. Welcome to a new series I'm doing that I'm going to call Holy Stories. Basically, it'll be very similar to what we've been doing with Muse lessons, but more focused in on religious texts from around the world. Sorry for kind of the messy stream this time. I'm still working on figuring out setting up the second channel. Had to change some things to make it work properly. The videos on this channel won't be going out to Facebook or Twitch for technical reasons, and the layout looks a little differently because I had to change it to make it work with the chat box and some various things. Long story short, it's in progress. Hopefully next time it'll look a little cleaner. Hello, Faku, Julie, Artemis, Daniel, thank you guys for joining me. Today we're going to be reading something called The Teaching of Buddha, which is a version of the Buddhist text, specifically the version from the Pure Land sect, which is majorly in Japan. I believe it's elsewhere. I know it's in the United States. This is actually a United States text, but originally came from Japan. This is basically the Bible of Buddhism, if you want to call it that. It's called the Tripitaka or Tipitaka, depending on which language you use. And this version of it is going to be the Japanese version. Now, what does that mean? Every culture has its own arrangement of the Buddhist texts when they have Buddhist religions in them. For the most part, unlike, say, Christianity, which tended to kind of copy-paste which pieces of things that they wanted for their text, the Buddhist texts tend to keep everything. They just kind of change which text they favor via which sect, and sometimes they add more things. So, for the most part, all the texts are going to have the same stuff. They might just be presented a little differently, and of course, in a different language. Hello, Heart Spider, welcome. You're allowed to be here anyway. It's funny to say. We've discussed Buddhism in part in various older videos, so I'll give a quick overview. Buddha was a guy. He was a person from many thousand years ago, living in what is now called India, born kind of in the Nepal area, if I remember correctly. He was the son of, according to legend, he was a prince. Unlikely to be true since the culture that he was from didn't have princes, but he was probably the son of like an aristocrat or a politician, someone with some power. He was sheltered in his childhood, and then eventually kind of realized the harshness of the real world, and he set out as a renunciate to find the way to solve everything. And eventually the way he came across was the Eightfold Path, which is a term that exists in a couple of religions. Hinduism, I think, what's the other one? There's a couple of terms, but in Buddhism, the Eightfold Path is the way to nirvana and enlightenment. A renunciate, in the terms of his culture, was someone that was stepping away from society. He was essentially shedding his societal place, his social status, so that he could go and focus on religion. He would have to beg for the rest of his life for food. He couldn't, he didn't earn money. He had to survive off of the alms that people would give him, which was part of the culture. It was considered good to give alms to these kind of wandering monks and priests because it was going to give you good karma for the next life. A lot of the ideas that he talks about existed before him. There were lots of monks at this time kind of trying to figure it out, and they each had their own little school, and they were wandering around, and they had their own ideas. Buddha's the one that's gotten the biggest. But what he did was he kind of twisted some of the older ideas and gave them a fresh look that became very, very popular, especially throughout most of Asia. India doesn't really have a Buddhist sect anymore. It's kind of died out there. But China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Cambodia, like all those places have a lot of Buddhism. We are going to start with, obviously, chapter 1. Sakyamuni Buddha, which is a term for Buddha. Sakyamuni means sage of the Shakya, which is the group of people that the Buddha came from, his family clan. Let me pull my notes out from under my microphone. So this is going to be a book divided into 3 parts. It's called the Tipitaka or Tripitaka, which basically means 3 baskets, and the baskets are kind of like the things that hold the knowledge. So it's 3 baskets or 3 books. One of them is based upon kind of the sermons of Buddha. One of them is focused in more on monks and what they should do and the rules that they should live by. And then the last section gets like really like deep and kind of more psychological, metaphysical about how the Buddhist minds like sees the universe. So for most Buddhists, the first section is probably the most useful. That's what we're going to start today. The life of Buddha. The Sakya clansmen dwelt along the Rohini River, which flows among the southern foothills of the Himalayas. Their king, Shuddhana Gautama, established his capital at Kapilavatthu, and there had a great castle built and ruled wisely, winning the acclaim of his people. The queen's name was Maya. She was the daughter of the king's uncle, who was also the king of a neighboring district of the same Shakya clan. For 20 years they had no children, but one night Queen Maya had a strange dream, in which she saw a white elephant entering into her womb through the right side of her chest, and she became pregnant. The king and the people looked forward with anticipation to the birth of a royal child. According to their custom, the queen returned to her parents' home for the birth, and on her way in the beautiful spring sunshine, she took a rest in the Lumbini garden. Fun story. Maya is a very important term in Buddhism and Hinduism. Here it's the name of the queen, but it also happens to be the term for illusion. The world we live in is Maya. It looks and it seems to be real and concrete, but it's not really. 100 years from now, this book, which seems so permanent and indestructible, like it exists in my hand, it won't exist anymore one day. Everything is impermanent, and Maya embodies that idea that the physical world that seems like the ultimate end-all be-all is just the beginning. It's not the ultimate. And if we allow it to define how we live and what we desire, we are being led astray. We are falling for the illusion. There's far more to the world than Maya. So I think it's interesting that the queen who gives birth to the Buddha is called Maya. All about her were Ashoka blossoms. In delight, she reached her right arm out to pluck a branch, and as she did so, a prince was born. All expressed their heartfelt delight with the glory of the queen and her princely child. Earth and heaven rejoiced. This memorable day was the 8th day of April. The joy of the king was extreme, and he named the child Siddhartha, which means every wish fulfilled. Trees are really important in Buddhism. The Buddha has his enlightenment moment, his realization underneath a tree, and he's also born under a tree, and the Ashoka tree is heavily associated with him. In the palace of the king, however, delight was followed quickly by sorrow, for after several days the lovely Queen Maya suddenly died. Her younger sister, Mahaprajapati, became the child's foster mother and brought him up with loving care. You see, Maya, the illusion, dies so quickly he never even knows his mother. Mahaprajapati, his aunt, her name has a few pieces of important Hindu terms in it as well. I believe it has the term for wisdom. I think Praja might be wisdom. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it seems fitting that that's possibly the name of his foster mother. A hermit called Asita, who lived in the mountains not far away, noticed a radiance about the castle. Interpreting it as a good omen, he came down to the palace and was shown the child. He predicted, "This prince, if he remains in the palace, when grown up, will become a great king and subjugate the whole world. But if he forsakes the court life to embrace a religious life, he will become a Buddha, the savior of the world." That is a very famous image to do with the Buddha, too. There was this idea that his destiny was so great, he would either basically become a tyrant or a savior. And the image of the warrior king Buddha is often used in various Buddhist sects and Buddhist stories as kind of like another image of what his possible destiny could have been. At first, the king was pleased to hear this prophecy, but later he started to worry about the possibility of his only son leaving the palace to become a homeless recluse. At the age of 7, the prince began his lessons in the civil and military arts, but his thoughts more naturally tended to other things. One spring day, he went out of the castle with his father. Together, they were watching a farmer at his plowing when he noticed a bird descended to the ground and carried off a small worm, which had been turned up by the farmer's plow. He sat down in the shade of a tree and thought about it, whispering to himself, "Alas, do all living creatures kill each other?" Again, he's under a tree. The prince, who had lost his mother so soon after his birth, was deeply affected by the tragedy of these little creatures. This spiritual wound deepened day by day as he grew up. Like a little scar on a young tree, the suffering of human life became more and more deeply ingrained in his mind. The king was increasingly worried as he recalled the hermit's prophecy and tried in every possible way to cheer the prince and to turn his thoughts in other directions. The king arranged the marriage of the prince at the age of 19 to the princess Yashodhara. She was the daughter of Suprabuddha, the lord of Devadaha Castle, and a brother of the late Queen Maya. You notice a little bit of incest going on. That would be normal. He's basically marrying his cousin. It was normal back then. For 10 years, in the different pavilions of spring, autumn, and the rainy season, the prince was immersed in rounds of music, dancing, and pleasure. But always his thoughts returned to the problem of suffering as he pensively tried to understand the true meaning of human life. The luxuries of the palace, this healthy body, this rejoicing youth, what do they mean to me, he thought. Someday we may be sick, we shall become aged. From death there is no escape. Pride of youth, pride of health, pride of existence, all thoughtful people should cast them aside. A man struggling for existence will naturally look for something of value. There are two ways of looking, a right way and a wrong way. If he looks in the wrong way, he recognizes that sickness, old age, and death are unavoidable, but he seeks the opposite. If he looks in the right way, he recognizes the true nature of sickness, old age, and death, and he searches for meaning in that which transcends all human sufferings. In my life of pleasures, I seem to be looking in the wrong way. Hey, Phil. Hey, Delvin. No, Phil, I don't think he had a sister. Fun story. There's always some discussion about these ancient figures as to whether or not they were real or if they existed. Did Jesus exist? Did Confucius exist? Did the Buddha exist? We know from examining the text that he probably did. Why do we say that? You can examine the historical documents of a specific person and look for patterns that tell you when it was written, who wrote it, how many people wrote it, and the way that this is written shows us that it really was originating in one source, that the stories and the way that they're told and the way that people repeat them sounds as if they are repeating things they had been told by one individual. So probably there was a Buddha back then. Are all the things in the book that, describe his life true? We'll never know. Thus, the spiritual struggle went on in the mind of the prince until his only child, Rahula, was born when he was 29. This seemed to bring things to a climax, for he then decided to leave the palace and look for the solution of his spiritual unrest in the homeless life of a mendicant. That's another term for a renunciate, a monk that leaves society to wander the world. He left the castle one night with his only charioteer, Chandaka, and his favorite horse, the snow-white Kanthaka. Now, this version of the story kind of brushes over it, but he left his wife and newborn child. And this is kind of a conflicting point as far as people who study and discuss Buddhism as to how moral it was to do that. On the one hand, they were rich, they were well off, he was not leaving them in dire straits. On the other, his mom died when he was a kid, and he never knew her, and now his son isn't gonna really know his dad. Well, later on, they reunite and things happen, but there is this sense of he's kind of left them, and there's this sense of loss there that I think is very interesting, and it's kind of also an aspect of him that isn't perfect, like, you left your newborn. His anguish did not end, and many devils tempted him, saying, "You would do better to return to the castle, for the whole world would soon be yours." But he told the devil that he did not want the whole world, so he shaved his head and turned his steps towards the south, carrying a begging bowl in his hand. In various versions of the story, the devil is often named Mara. The Hindu, well, not Hindu versions, but the Indian versions, early stories tend to include Mara, who I think is a Hindu demon or an Indian demon. It kind of blurs together because they are all, a lot of different cultures were sharing in that time period. This doesn't really name the devil, it just says there were some. The prince first visited the hermit Bhagava and watched his ascetic practices. He then went to Arada Kalama and Udraka Ramaputra to learn their methods of attaining enlightenment through meditation. But after practicing them for a time, he became convinced they would not lead him to enlightenment. These are actually historical people. He did learn from quite a few different monks and other teachers of the time, before deciding that their paths were not working for him. Finally, he went to the land of Magadha and practiced asceticism in the forest of Uruvela on the banks of the Nairajana River, which flows by Gaya village. The methods of his practice were unbelievably rigorous. He spurred himself on with the thought that no ascetic in the past, none in the present, and none in the future ever has practiced or ever will practice more earnestly than I do. Still, the prince did not realize his goal. After 6 years in the forest, he gave up the practice of asceticism. Now, when it says asceticism here, it means extreme denial. Like I said earlier, there were a lot of different monks and a lot of different schools of thought at this time trying to find the ways to enlightenment, and each had their own idea. One of them was to deny yourself so fully from the pleasures of the world, from food and drink, cause physical pain to yourself, thinking that this pain would be the way to set yourself free from the world. Buddha said, no, this isn't working for me. Does it actually discuss... It doesn't actually seem to discuss this. In different versions of the story, it said that he got so ill he almost died, and he realized, this doesn't actually help with enlightenment in any way. This isn't helping me. Hello, Akatsuki, welcome. He went bathing in the river and accepted a bowl of milk from the hand of Sujata, a maiden who lived in the neighboring village. The 5 companions who'd lived with the prince during the 6 years of his ascetic practice were shocked he could receive milk from the hand of a maiden. They thought him degraded and left him. Basically, they saw that he gave up on denying himself, and they were like, "You weakling, we're leaving." Don't worry, they come back. Thus the prince was left alone. He was still weak, but at the risk of losing his life, he attempted yet another period of meditation, saying to himself, "Blood may become exhausted, flesh may decay, bones may fall apart, but I will never leave this place until I find the way to enlightenment." It was an intense and incomparable struggle for him. He was desperate and filled with confusing thoughts. Dark shadows overhung his spirit, and he was beleaguered by all the lures of the devils. Carefully and patiently he examined them one by one and rejected them all. It was a hard struggle indeed, making his blood run thin, his flesh fall away, and his bones crack. But when the morning star appeared in the eastern sky, the struggle was over, and the prince's mind was as clear and bright as the breaking day. He had at last found the path to enlightenment. It was December 8th when the prince became a Buddha at 35 years of age. Phil! Given the Buddhist middle way, does that mean Buddha is a switch? I don't know that we can discuss Buddha's sexual life, non-existent sexual life. He believed that monks shouldn't have sex. Basically, monks have more important things to focus on, so was not a thing for them. Not that every monk ever followed, especially after Japanese monks in particular kind of quickly decided that that was not an important aspect. And fun story, Japanese tradition says, folktale kind of says that homosexuality was imported from China via Buddhism. Specifically a monk called Kukai, I believe. I'll have to look up and see if I'm remembering the name right. Basically, homosexuality was so common amongst these monks, these Buddhist monks, that they were known for it. And story goes that the samurai started to kind of become similar to these monks because samurai and Buddhist monks were very closely, communities that were closely intertwined. So, story goes that Buddhism brought the gays to Japan. Of course, that's not, that's silly, but it was heavily associated with them. Alright, let's see here. From this time on, the prince was known by different names. Some spoke of him as Buddha, the perfectly enlightened one, Tathagata. Some spoke of him as Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakya clan. Others called him the world-honored one. He went first to Migradava in Varanasi, where the 5 mendicants who'd lived with him during the 6 years of his ascetic life were staying. At first they shunned him, but after they talked with him, they believed in him and became his first followers. Oh wow, it's really going fast through this life. That was his first sermon. It's called, let's see here. It's over here somewhere. But yeah, so the 5 mendicants, the 5 aesthetics that ran away from him when they were like, you guys, you're a weakling. They became his first followers. He kind of went back to them and said, hey, I figured it out. You want to hear my story? And they were like, yeah. And it's a very famous sermon. It's one of the first sermons it's the first sermon he gives, and it's one of the earliest pieces of the literature, and I cannot remember the name of it right now. But anyway, this story seems to just kind of be sliding through his life very quickly, and then later on it probably goes deeper into the sermons. I'm gonna doubt Japan has a lot of weird sex things. Yeah, I don't think it's really logical to think that any kind of sexuality was really imported to any place. People have been doing that kind of stuff since forever, but I think it's a testament to how much it was associated with it that story came about, Alright. Let's see here. He then went to Rajagira Castle and won over King Bimbisara, who had always been his friend. He's going to end up really important. He's the most major non-monk Buddhist in the very beginning. Because at the time, he was really aiming his sermons and his speeches at people who were going to renounce society and walk away from it. He taught to everybody, but he wasn't really aiming at the general populace in the same way, because they weren't going to be able to reach enlightenment because they have to, work to eat. And if you have to work, you have to have desires. And anyway, long story short, Bimbisara, the king, is the one who, on his deathbed, will be like, Buddha, guys, I'm really worried about dying and being reincarnated and stuff. How do I get enlightenment? And then that they were telling him more of the things that the monks believed about enlightenment, and how, going into further depth in the teachings than they usually did with the average person. And Bimbisara was like, why have you been keeping this secret? I don't care if I'm an average person. Tell me this stuff. It'll help, maybe. And then from then on, they started preaching in the same way to the average person, rather than kind of keeping most things for the monks. From there, he went about the country, living on alms and teaching men to accept his way of life. Men responded to him as the thirsty seek water and the hungry food. 2 great disciples, Sariputra and I always struggle with this man's name, Maudgalyayana, and their 2,000 followers came to him. Those 2 are also very important. They tend to be kind of seen as the right and left hands of the Buddha. They're always chilling with him. Tradition says that the 2 great schools of Buddhist thought descend from these 2 great people. Theravada, which is the oldest school, the one that focuses at monkhood and retreating from society, and Mahayana, the one that focuses on society and the average person and reaching out to everybody. At first, the Buddha's father, King Shuddhana, still inwardly suffered because of his son's decision to leave the palace, remained aloof, but then became his faithful disciple. Mahaprajapati, the Buddha's stepmother, and Princess Yashodhara, his wife, and all the members of the Sakya clan began to follow him. Multitudes of others also became his devoted and faithful followers. Excuse me, I got the hiccups. It doesn't mention his son, but his son does also join them at one point. For 45 years, the Buddha went about the country preaching and persuading men to follow his way of life. But when he was 80, at Vaisali and on his way from Rajagira to Shravasti, he became ill and predicted that after 3 months he would enter nirvana. Still, he journeyed on until he reached Pava, where he fell seriously ill from some food offered by Chunda, a blacksmith. Eventually, in spite of great pain and weakness, he reached the forest that bordered Kusinagara. Lying between 2 large sala trees, he continued teaching his disciples until his last moment. Thus he entered into perfect tranquility after he had completed his work as the world's greatest teacher. You might have noticed there's a lot of controversy about how to interpret the Buddha's death, because there's this throwaway line here, which is explored in more depth in some other versions, that he dies because he gets ill from eating food someone gave him. So someone essentially accidentally poisoned the Buddha. It's kind of interpreted in different ways, where some versions of it almost seem to be like Buddha trying to cover for the fact that he knows that this man has accidentally killed him. I don't think it ever is implied that it was on purpose, but more like it was just bad food. That he kind of tries to cover it, being like, yes, my fated time has come, even though really it kind of was an accident. It's kind of the vibe I was getting from some of these versions. It changes based on which version you read, but somebody accidentally killed the Buddha. That sucks. Under the guidance of Ananda, the Buddha's favorite disciple, the body was cremated by his friends in Kusinagara. 7 neighboring rulers, as well as King Ajatasattu, King Ajatasattu demanded the relics be divided among them. The people of Kusinagara at first refused, and the dispute even threatened to end in war. But under the advice of a wise man named Drona, the crisis passed and the relics were divided among the 8 great countries. The ashes of the funeral pyre and the earthen jar that contained the relics were also given to 2 other rulers to be likewise honored. Thus, 10 great towers commemorating the Buddha were built to enshrine his relics and ashes. So Ananda, one of my favorite Buddhist figures, it mentions him very quickly here and just says, he was the favorite. Ananda was really, really good at memorization. He could remember basically everything the Buddha said. He was a walking dictionary of their texts, because at the time they weren't writing things down, they were reciting and remembering them. And he was with Buddha all the time, basically his little follower, little assistant guy, and he was with him when the Buddha died. But he wasn't considered enlightened. He wasn't considered kind of like the highest monk. He wasn't that capable. He hadn't reached it. He hadn't been able to really meditate and get to the point that many of the other followers of Buddha had gotten. So he was kind of seen as a little bit of a failure, kind of. He felt really horrible about it. He wanted to be like the other monks who could do these amazing things and had reached such heights of enlightenment, but he couldn't do it. So after Buddha dies, there is this meeting that's going to be had. I don't remember how much time passed, but some time had passed, and they were going to have a meeting because basically after the Buddha died, they didn't want the sect to kind of fall apart. They had to figure out how they were going to organize things, who was going to be in charge. So they called together this meeting. Unfortunately, poor Ananda, despite the fact that he's so intelligent and knowledgeable about what Buddha said, and he was Buddha's closest friend, he's not technically qualified to attend this meeting because he hasn't reached the highest level that he can. He doesn't qualify. He doesn't have the proper papers. So he meditates for 10 days, just trying so hard. I've got to do this so I can pass and I can get in. And finally, it's an hour to the meeting, and he's like, well, I guess it's not going to happen. It is what it is. He accepts it and immediately gains enlightenment. Just like that. And he gets to go to the meeting. What a great story that is. Just how perfect that he tries so hard, and it's only when he accepts he can't that he does. Alright, so that was the story of Buddha's life. That was part 1. Part 2 is called The Last Teaching of the Buddha, which is going to discuss what he says when he's on his deathbed. Once again, under some trees. Always trees with the Buddha. Beneath the sala trees at Kusinagara, in his last words to his disciples, the Buddha said, "Make a light of yourself. Rely upon yourself. Do not depend upon anyone else. Make my teachings your light. Rely upon them. Do not depend upon any other teachings. Consider your body. Think of its impurity, knowing that both its pain and its delight are alike causes of suffering. How can you indulge in its desires? Consider yourself. Think of its transiency. How can you fall into delusion about it and cherish pride and selfishness, knowing that they all must end in inevitable suffering? Consider all substances. Can you find among them any enduring self? Are they not all aggregates that sooner or later will break apart and be scattered? Do not be confused by the universality of suffering, but follow my teaching, even after my death, and you will be rid of pain. Do this, and you will indeed be my disciples. My disciples, the teachings that I have given you are never to be forgotten or abandoned. They are always to be treasured. They are to be thought about. They are to be practiced. If you follow these teachings, you will always be happy. The point of the teachings is to control your own mind. Keep your mind from greed, and you will keep your behavior right, your mind pure, and your words faithful. Be always thinking about the transiency of your life. You will be able to resist greed and anger, and will be able to avoid all ills. If you find your mind tempted and so entangled in greed, you must suppress and control the temptation. Be the master of your own mind. A man's mind may make him a Buddha, or it may make him a beast. Misled by error, one becomes a demon. Enlightened, one becomes a Buddha. Therefore, control your mind and do not let it deviate from the right path. You should respect each other. Follow my teachings and refrain from disputes. You should not, like water and oil, repel each other, but should, like milk and water, mingle together. Study together. Learn together. Practice my teachings together. Do not waste your mind and time in idleness and quarreling. Enjoy the blossoms of enlightenment in their season, and harvest the fruit of the right path. The teachings which I have given you, I gained by following the path myself. You should follow these teachings, and conform to their spirit on every occasion. If you neglect them, it means that you have never really met me. It means that you are far from me, even if you are actually with me. But if you accept and practice my teachings, then you are very near to me, even though you are far away. My disciples, my end is approaching. Our parting is near, but do not lament. Life is ever changing. None can escape the disillusion of the body. This I am now to show by my own death, my body falling apart like a dilapidated cart. Do not vainly lament, but realize that nothing is permanent, and learn from it the emptiness of human life. Do not cherish the unworthy desire that the changeable might become unchanging. The demon of worldly desires is always seeking to chances to deceive the mind. If a viper lives in your room and you wish to have a peaceful sleep, you must first chase it out. You must break the bonds of worldly passions and drive them away as you would a viper. You must positively protect your own mind. My disciples, my last moment has come, but do not forget that death is only the end of the physical body. The body was born from parents and was nourished by food, just as inevitable are illness and sickness and death. But the true Buddha is not a human body, it is enlightenment. A human body must die, but the wisdom of enlightenment will exist forever in the truth of the Dharma and in the practice of the Dharma. He who sees merely my body does not truly see me. Only he who accepts my teachings truly sees me. After my death, the Dharma shall be your teacher. Follow the Dharma, and you will be true to me. During the last 45 years of my life, I have withheld nothing from my teachings. There is no secret teaching, no hidden meaning. Everything has been taught openly and clearly. My dear disciples, this is the end. In a moment, I shall be passing into nirvana. This is my instruction. So, fun stuff here. Dharma is a term for, like, the teaching, the proper way to be, the way to live according to Buddha's vision of the world. The Dharma is his teachings. The Buddha himself, there's a line here. Let's see if I can find it again. There's a part where he says, essentially, this I am now to show by my own death, my body falling apart. So, depending on which school of Buddhism you are part of, some schools see Buddha as a human man who lived and died. Others saw him as a god. that he chose, kind of like Jesus and that whole thing, to descend into a human body and live a proper life to give an example to all us other humans as to how to live a proper life. That's what that line means. This particular school agrees with the idea that Buddha was actually a god who descended to take on human flesh in order to show us how to live an ideal life. Other groups go further. Hinduism states that Buddha is one of the 10 incarnations of Krishna, one of their major religious figures. Lots of different schools kind of see that differently as to whether Buddha was just a guy that was really awesome or literally divine in some way. Chapter 2. The Eternal and Glorified Buddha. His compassion and vows. The spirit of Buddha is that of great loving kindness and compassion. The great loving kindness is the spirit to save all people by any and all means. The great compassion is the spirit that prompts it to be ill with the illness of people, to suffer with their suffering. Your suffering is my suffering, and your happiness is my happiness, said Buddha. And just as a mother always loves her child, he does not forget that spirit, even for a single moment, for it is the nature of Buddhahood to be compassionate. The focus here on the compassion of Buddha is a staple of Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana is one of the two major divisions in Buddhist thought. I mentioned earlier, Theravada is the older one that focuses on monk livelihood, kind of let's withdraw from society and focus on our souls and our enlightenment ourselves. You can only save yourself. Well, Mahayana Buddhism says, but we should focus on saving everyone, because what's the point if we leave all these people behind? Even though they can't, reach enlightenment the same way that monks do, surely there's something we can do. And so this focus on compassion is a major aspect of Mahayana Buddhism, the idea that we should have compassion and affection for everyone and want to save them all. The Buddha's spirit of compassion is stimulated according to the needs of men. Man's faith is the reaction to this spirit, and it leads him to enlightenment. Just as a mother realizes her motherhood by loving her child, then the child reacting to that love feels safe and at ease. Yet people do not understand the spirit of Buddha and go on suffering from the illusions and desires that arise from their ignorance. They suffer from their own deeds accumulated through worldly passions and wander about among the mountains of delusion with the heavy burden of their evil deeds. Do not think that the compassion of the Buddha is only for the present life. It is a manifestation of the timeless compassion of the eternal Buddha that has been operative since unknown time, when mankind went astray due to ignorance. This is another major feature of certain sects of Buddhism, the idea that Buddhas always existed. Specifically, Buddha has been reincarnating over and over and over. And so the Buddha that we know here in this book is just one version of him. He has come here before and taught all this before, and it's been forgotten, because that's just inevitable. History changes, things are lost. The Buddha himself said that this is going to be lost again one day, which, if you look at India, which is where it started, and now there's really nothing of Buddhism there, it kind of makes sense. The idea is that there's going to be a 10th, I think it's 10th or is it 11th, incarnation of Buddha, and they've named him already. I don't remember what the name is, but there were multiple people in the 20th century that were claimed to be the next incarnation of him, mostly by Westerners. Unfortunately, there was one guy that was, I think his situation was kind of effed up, and eventually he escaped the people that tried to kind of put the Buddha hood on him, but it's one of the main ideas of certain sects of Buddhism that tend to also, believe in the kind of divine Buddha. Let's see here. Do not think... Oh, no, I read that. The eternal Buddha always appears before people in the most friendly forms and brings to them the wisest methods of relief. Shakyamuni Buddha, born a prince among his Shakya kinsmen, left the comforts of home to live a life of asceticism. Through the practice of silent meditation, he realized enlightenment. He preached the Dharma among his fellow men and finally manifested it by his earthly death. The working of Buddhahood is as everlasting as human ignorance is endless, and as the depth of ignorance is bottomless, so Buddha's compassion is boundless. When Buddha decided to break from the worldly life, he made 4 great vows: to save all people, to renounce all worldly desires, to learn all the teachings, and to attain perfect enlightenment. These vows were manifestations of the love and compassion that are fundamental to the nature of Buddhahood. Buddha first taught himself to avoid the sin of killing any living creature. He wished that all people might know the blessedness of a long life. Buddha trained himself to avoid the sin of stealing. He wished that all people might have everything they needed. Buddha trained himself to avoid ever committing adultery. He wished that all people might know the blessedness of a pure spirit and not suffer from insatiable desires. Buddha, aiming at this ideal, trained himself to remain free from all deception. He wished that all people might know the tranquility of mind that would follow in speaking the truth. He trained himself to avoid double talk. He wished that all people might know the joy of fellowship. He trained himself to avoid abusing others, and then he wished that all might know have the serene mind that would follow by living in peace with others. He kept himself free from idle talk, and wished that all might know the blessedness of sympathetic understanding. Buddha, aiming at his ideal, trained himself to keep free from greed, and by this virtuous deed he wished that all people might know the peacefulness that would go with this freedom. He trained himself to avoid anger, and he wished that all people might love one another. He trained himself to avoid ignorance, and he wished that all people might understand and not disregard the law of causation. Let's explain this real quick. These are basically, there's like 7 rules that the monks had to live by. Technically, it's not something everyone has to live by, except for some of them. Like, normal people aren't kept from having sex. Here it says adultery. It's kind of adjusted to be like, these are rules for everybody. In the original text, the monks were kept from having any kind of sex, because it was seen as a distraction from their goal. You're not supposed to steal, because obviously that's going to hurt people and take from them. We don't want to kill, because everything is a living thing. And when you have the idea of reincarnation, where you can be reborn as an animal, well, you could be killing grandma. You don't want to kill any grandma. Now, Buddhism tends to be less militaristic about this than some sects of, say, Hinduism, where Buddhism recognizes that everything is in context, and that some people have to eat meat to survive. It's not like one of those things where, you know, how dare you, if you have to, you have to. That one's a little flexible, kind of like the sex one. If, avoid being too desirous of sex, but obviously the average person's going to have sex. The average person's going to eat meat. These are ideals. And then the last one, the law of causation. This is a centerpiece of Buddha's thoughts. Hello, Natasha. The law of causation basically says that everything in the world is happening because of something else. Like, I pick up this book and I drop it, and it fell. Why did it fall? Because I picked it up and I dropped it. There's this causation effect. And that goes for everything. So as long as you are acting and reacting, you are causing things. So if you allow, say, your anger to make you lash out at somebody, well, now you've caused them pain, and you're part of this, law of causation. It's only once you step back and start to control yourself that you see how this law acts, and you can try and keep yourself from participating in it to a certain extent. It gets a lot more complicated than that. That's kind of an overview of it. Thus, Buddha's compassion embraces all people, and his constant consideration is for their happiness. He loves people as parents love their children, and he wishes the highest blessedness for them, namely that they will be able to pass beyond this ocean of life and death. Not militant, that's Pure Land Buddhism. That's technically what this book is Pure Land Buddhism. But how it's practiced changes wildly, and also, I'm talking very generally about Buddhism. I'm using this text because it's the only one I have physically, but yes, obviously all the different sects do things differently and have different levels of militaristic things, and whether or not they're very strict about certain things. Anyway. Part 2. Buddha's relief and salvation for us. It is very difficult for the words spoken by Buddha from the far bank of enlightenment to reach the people still struggling in the world of delusion. Therefore, Buddha returns to this world himself and uses his methods of salvation. Now I will tell you a parable, Buddha said. Once there lived a wealthy man whose house caught on fire. The man was away from home, and when he came back, he found that his children were so absorbed in play, they had not noticed the fire and were still inside the house. The father screamed, "Get out, children! Come out of the house! Hurry!" But the children did not heed him. The anxious father shouted again, "Children, I have some wonderful toys here. Come out of the house and get them." Heeding his cry this time, the children ran out of the burning house. The world is a burning house. The people, unaware the house is on fire, are in danger of being burned to death, so Buddha, in compassion, devises ways of saving them. This is a very famous parable that's meant to kind of explain the various teachings and methods that Buddha has for reaching enlightenment are kind of ways of dangling that toy in front of the kid and saying, come on, the house is on fire, get out of the house! It's a very powerful image. Buddha said, "I will tell you another parable. Once upon a time, the only son of a wealthy man left his home and fell into extreme poverty. When the father traveled far from home in search of his son, he lost track of him. He did everything he could to find his son, but in vain. Decades later, his son, now reduced to wretchedness, wandered near where his father was living. The father quickly recognized his son and sent his servants to bring the wanderer home, who was overcome by the majestic appearance of the mansion. He feared they were deceiving him and would not go with them. He did not realize it was his own father. The father again sent his servants to offer him some money to become a servant in their rich master's household. The son accepted the offer and returned with them to his father's house and became a servant. Ah, I see what you're saying, Akatsuki. The father gradually advanced him until he was put in charge of all the properties and treasures, but still the son did not recognize his own father. The father was pleased with his son's faithfulness, and at the end of his life, as the end of his life drew near, he called together his relatives and friends and told them, "Friends, this is my only son, the son I sought for many years. From now on, all my property and treasures belong to him." The son was surprised at his father's confession, and said, "Not only have I found my father, but all his property and treasure is now mine." The wealthy man in the parable represents Buddha, and the wandering son, all people. Buddha's compassion embraces all people with the love of a father for his only son. In that love, he conceives the wisest methods to lead, teach, and enrich them with the treasure of enlightenment. I really didn't need that mental image, Phil. Just as rain falls on all vegetation, so Buddha's compassion extends equally to all people. Just as different plants receive particular benefits from the same rain, so people of different natures and circumstances are blessed in different ways. Parents love all their children, but their love is expressed with special tenderness toward a sick child. Buddha's compassion is equal toward all people, but it is expressed with special care towards those who, because of their ignorance, have heavier burdens of evil and suffering to bear. The sun rises in the eastern sky and clears away the darkness of the world without prejudice or favoritism toward any particular region. So Buddha's compassion encompasses all people, encouraging them to do right and guides them against evil. Thus he clears away the darkness of ignorance and leads people to enlightenment. Buddha is a father in his compassion and a mother in his loving kindness. In their ignorance and bondage to worldly desire, people often act with excessive zeal. Buddha is also zealous, but out of compassion for all people. They are helpless without Buddha's compassion, and must receive his methods of salvation as his children. Let's see. Okay. Part 3, the Eternal Buddha. Common people believe that Buddha was born a prince and learned the way to enlightenment as a mendicant. Actually, Buddha has always existed in the world which is without beginning or end. As the Eternal Buddha, he has known all people and applied all methods of relief. There is no falsity in the eternal Dharma which Buddha taught, for he knows all things in the world as they are, and he teaches them to all people. Indeed, it is very difficult to understand the world as it is, for although it seems true, it is not. And although it seems false, it is not. Ignorant people cannot know the truth concerning the world. This is back to the fact that the world is made of illusion. It is Maya. It seems real, but it's not eternal, but yet it does exist. Kind of a metaphysical paradox there. Buddha alone truly and fully knows the world as it is, and he never says that it is true or false, or good or evil. He simply portrays the world as it is. What Buddha does teach is this: that all people should cultivate roots of virtue according to their natures, their deeds, and their beliefs. This teaching transcends all affirmation and negation of this world. Buddha teaches not only through words, but also through his life. Although his life is endless, in order to awaken greedy people, he used the expedient of death. While a certain physician was away from home, his children accidentally took some poison. When the physician returned, he noticed their sickness and prepared an antidote. Some of the children who were not seriously poisoned accepted the medicine and were cured, but others were so seriously affected they refused to take the medicine. The physician, prompted by paternal love for his children, decided on an extreme method to press the cure upon them. He said to the children, "I must go off on a long journey. I am old and may pass away any day. If I am with you, I can care for you, but if I should pass away, you will become worse and worse. If you hear of my death, I implore you to take the antidote and be cured of this subtle poisoning." Thus he went on the long journey. After a time, he sent a messenger to his children to inform them of his death. The children, receiving the message, were deeply affected by the thought of their father's death, and by the realization they would no longer have the benefit of his benevolent care. Recalling his parting request, in a feeling of sorrow and helplessness, they took the medicine and recovered. People must not condemn the deception of this father-physician. Buddha is like that father. He too employs the fiction of life and death to save people who are entangled in the bondage of desires. Were there any known female Buddhists? Yes! So, Buddhism had women from an early time, and for a time was freer with women. This probably changed a couple of centuries after it began. There was a story of how the female monks, actually Buddha's aunt basically came to him and said, "Hey, why can't women, become monks?" And he was like, "They can't." And she was like, "Well, they can be enlightened, right?" And he was like, "Well, yeah." And she said, "Well, if they can be enlightened, why can't they be monks?" And he was like, "Okay." This is probably a apocryphal story added to explain the history of female monks, but the truth is we know that there were female monks, and there were a lot of schools of female monks. There were more rules placed on them at certain periods of history. Nowadays, I'm not sure how much that's changed, but there are a lot of specifically female sects of Buddhism the world over. Let's see here. Why does Buddha sound like Jesus? They have a lot in common, honestly. And there's even stories that they might have met. There's myths that he showed up over there. And anyway, I'll have to look into that more because I don't know. I just know that that's a story or was it Buddha or was it? I think it was Buddha, but there's stories that Jesus traveled to India at one point. We'll never know if that's true, I don't believe. Thank you for listening. I don't know if or when we'll continue this, but I thought it was a neat idea to discuss in more detail the actual texts of various religions. We'll have more videos on religious topics in the future as well, kind of like the Muse lessons, but more specified. Like, I have one where we read the literature, one where we discuss, like, queer themes, various different things I'm working on. I'll come back with a game stream in a little while. Gonna go have lunch. Thanks again for listening. I'm still setting up this new setup, so I don't have an ending screen right now, but thanks for watching. I guess I don't want it to cut out the last 30 seconds like it does sometimes, so I guess I'm just gonna chill right here for a minute and let the clock go up. Yeah, I'm still putting this together. I had to change and add another account because it wouldn't allow me to connect two YouTube accounts to the same one, so that's why it now looks very different, and I'm having to rebuild it from scratch because I had to change that. Yeah, there is a manga, Holy Saint Men, Saint something, where Jesus and Buddha are roommates, and it's really funny. Saint Young Men, that's what it's called. It's really great. Aw, thank you guys. I saw a movie years ago about an ancient immortal man who was Jesus attempting to spread Buddhism. Huh, that's interesting. Huh, okay.